Hello, it's Reverend Dr. Chris Wilson again, and we are approaching our fifth session on the study of the Gospel of Matthew, looking at the Jewish nature, the rabbinical qualities of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel. And for this fifth session, we are looking at actually the fourth major discourse or teaching segment in Matthew's Gospel. And today's focus is on this fourth discourse. It is called the Community Discourse, and it is chapter 18 in the Gospel of Matthew. And this community discourse is important. It's one of the things that's to note is the audience for chapter 18 is specifically the disciples. So in many cases, it's the disciples and the crowds, but in this case, the disciples are the primary audience of Jesus for this teaching piece, this fourth discourse. I think with knowing that it's intended for the disciples specifically, this discourse is important in terms of a legacy that Jesus wants to leave behind. And saying that is, we know as we read through the Gospel of Matthew that Jesus eventually gets arrested and killed, crucified before he's resurrected. There's a sense that Jesus wants certain things to be communicated to the disciples before his own death unfolds. And one of the things I think that's really important with this discourse is, call it the Community Discourse. It is really a chapter that talks about some significant pieces of what it means to form healthy community, how they understand one another. And Jesus is pretty clear in this teaching chapter of some things that will be essential elements of what it means to be a community, what it means to be a gathering of believers, not just a bunch of individuals that believe similar things, but a bunch of individuals that gather and form true community with one another. And when you form true community with one another, there are certain elements that allow that community to be healthy and whole and thriving and meaningful. And so this chapter has within it some hints of what it means to be what we would call today church, what they would have called themselves as a community of believers or followers of the way. They weren't just a bunch of independent people that liked Jesus, that thought Jesus was pretty significant, that they bound together and formed communities. And these communities had to be grounded in something besides just believing in Jesus, that there were other things that held them accountable to one another. So this discourse is important to the disciples in that way because they will need these truths later on in their life and sharing their discipleship. The other thing that's interesting about this chapter is there's a little bit of dialogue, and it's not just Jesus teaching and they sit and listen the whole time. The disciples ask questions. Even starts out, well, who's the greatest among us? Which is kind of a fascinating question. The disciples are already should have been thought of themselves as important to Jesus because he selected them to follow him and be close to him throughout his entire ministry. And yet the disciples kind of get hung up in, I guess we're special, but who's the most important person of all of us here? Who's even the most important of us? And Jesus is quick to point out in this community discourse, I would say one of the first things he gets at is humility. Don't think too highly of yourselves. And we all need a dose of humility from time to time, but Jesus wants humility to be embedded in their own understanding of what discipleship is about. It's not about reaching a certain status or a certain clout, or I'm more important than you, or you're less important than me. And he wants to dismiss that right from the beginning and eliminate that from the minds of the disciples early on, is that this is an even playing field here. There's no one more important than another. And one of the things that is done is the first third of chapter 18, Jesus uses to teach them through the metaphor of children or through the example of children. And it sounds kind of sweet, but societally, children were not very well thought of. In terms of the ranking of importance, children were kind of down toward the bottom of the stratus of, when it talks of people of importance, they were pretty low on the ladder in terms of value to communities. And when Jesus says early on in the chapter, unless you're like a child, it says in there, unless you become like a little child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And we just had that whole kingdom thing in the last session in chapter 13 of what the kingdom of heaven is all about and how important that is. And he says, unless you're like a child, you can't enter this kingdom. He is reversing what they know is the ladder of status. He's kind of tipping it upside down and making a 180 and saying you need to reevaluate what you think status and importance really is amongst yourselves and even in society. And that kind of makes its way through in terms of this idea of the imagery of children, the little ones or children. John Meyer talks about this continual reference to children, and it's by intention on Jesus' part. Children are referenced in terms of questions of greatness. Children are referenced in terms of their role of not one being pushing people out of the way in terms of path of discipleship. Children are referenced in terms of those who have lost their way. We had the story of the parable of the lost sheep. And those that have lost their way, he compares those that have lost their way much like little children, and they're to be brought into the fold as well. 3 different instances in chapter 18, he references the little ones, that phrase, the little ones. And Jesus, as I said earlier, is kind of flipping the idea of who's important and who needs to be included in the kingdom that Jesus is living out. The other kind of interesting piece is the back half of chapter 18, and it's the word that kind of surfaces quite a bit is the word forgiveness, or the theme of forgiveness. How many times are we supposed to forgive people? Not just 7 times, 70 times 7. Forgiveness is something important to think about in terms of relationship building and community building. If we have relationships that are broken, you can't be community with one another. There has to be a path for healing and reconciliation if community is going to be true community. In my own experience, and my guess yours is too, and not that forgiveness is easy, but once a relationship has reached a place of brokenness or a difficult place, when forgiveness really happens, that relationship in many ways can become stronger because of that forgiveness. And I think Jesus offers this path of forgiveness in this community discourse as a path to stronger community life. Recognizing that we want to be forgiven, and yet we also must forgive. And there's the parable of the unforgiving servant that comes at the end of chapter 18. It says, it's all good when you're the recipient of forgiveness, but when you fail to provide forgiveness for others, it's a breakdown in community. Community can't be what community is called to be unless forgiveness works both ways. Forgiveness doesn't mean we forget, but forgiveness offers an opportunity for healing, for within ourselves and with others. When we refrain from forgiving, we prevent ourselves from finding a path to wholeness just within. So John Meyer talks about some of these themes, and this chapter lays out what I think are some really important themes throughout the chapter. I think humility is one of those, elimination of status, that those on the margins are just as important as those that are considered on the inside. And Jesus begins to eliminate those that are in and those that are out. His ministry is clear about that, and the people that he interacts with, the people he engages with, the people he welcomes, the people he heals, the people, all the people he engages with. He tries to eliminate kind of a binary of in and out, right and wrong. He tries to say community is all of us, and we shouldn't put a boundary around who we should include and who we should exclude. There's a place in the chapter about conflict resolution. If there's conflicts or disagreements, a process for doing that, and how we resolve conflicts. And we have that famous phrase that shows up in Matthew, where 2 or 3 are gathered, there I am in the midst of them. Is that we are community. It's through resolution, it's through forgiveness, it's through reconciliation that Christ's presence is most powerfully experienced when we are gathered together. I mentioned forgiveness and that we want our words and our actions to match one another. And this is kind of this isn't a constitution, it's not bylaws, it's not organizing documents, but it's behavioral ways that we understand that if community is going to happen, these things have to be a part of community. Imagine a community without humility. Imagine a community that's chock full of all kinds of people with status, and we let status get in the way. Imagine if we get to choose who's in and out and create boundaries of exclusion. Imagine a community that doesn't forgive. Imagine a community where people can say one thing, but their words and their actions don't coincide, just all words, no action. I mean, talk about a dysfunctional community. The opposite of those things, of humility, elimination of status, elimination of who's in and who's out, resolving conflicts in healthy ways, forgiveness, and words and actions matching one another. That's a recipe for community that's health and wholeness that we all look towards. Gene Boring even breaks the chapter down in 2 significant ways. I have a slide for us to look at. And when you look at this slide, Gene Boring breaks the piece down, and you'll see that the little people showing up again. He says, the first part of the chapter is the consideration of the little people, big people and little people, against sustaining little people, and the parabolic conclusion of the parable of the lost sheep, of concern for the stray little people. Just that reminder of who you think is least important is probably most important. In the back half of the chapter, Gene Boring maps out in this chapter discipline and forgiveness. There is a church discipline and a presence of Christ. The forgiveness without grace, you can't have that. And then there's the parabolic conclusion of the unforgiving servant. That you have teaching, parable, teaching, parable. And so there's a clear structure to chapter 18 that's really important in terms of how the chapter is put together. And that just as 13, as we talked about the last session, was all parable, is that when Jesus is speaking directly to the disciples, he gives them didactic teaching through conversation, and he ends each section of didactic with a parable, a story, to help them remember what it means to be community. The parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the unforgiving servant become 2 parables that shape what it means to live out community even after Jesus is gone. Tom Long suggests that this teaching about community is important at this juncture because he feels, maybe Jesus senses that he needs to communicate this idea of community before they reach Jerusalem, before they get to the holy city at the time of Passover. Because once they get to Jerusalem, it's going to get pretty chaotic, and Jesus will be even more scrutinized when they get to the holy city of Jerusalem. So as any good rabbi, he wants his words to have kind of carrying influence, to be long-lived after his own life. And so, in a sense, this community discourse comes before the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem. So he wants this particular community teaching to be disseminated to the disciples before the intensity of Jerusalem's week when it unfolds. It becomes an exchange. As you pay attention to the whole chapter, I alluded that there's questions asked. One of the classic Jewish forms of teaching and learning is not a listener and a teacher, it's a conversation. The Jewish tradition has a long history of learning through dialogue, learning through sometimes argument and pushing one idea over another, and that truth comes out of the conversation. And chapter 18 is a classic Jewish model of integration of learning through question and dialogue and conversation. That Jesus welcomes the questions, and the questions invite the listener more deeply into the subject matter, whatever it is. And Jesus is passing on truths, I think. This community discourse, I would say, in kind of some concluding comments, this community discourse is meant to be community as relational rather than community as structural. The eventual church should be grounded in a relational formation that is based on honesty and humility rather than on rules and formal processes. Though we need those kind of things in the church, how we function as church should be more relational rather than structural. The church is always and should always defer to people rather than a rule. The church should live its life with egalitarian qualities rather than hierarchical systems. You don't need a top-down system where one person's more important than the other. You want a flat experience as a faith community. A person's been in the church 30 years or a person's been in the church 2 weeks. Neither person is more or less important than the other. And we get that from this community discourse. And ultimately, Jesus' community discourse are lessons, are attributes of how a community of believers will shape itself in the moment and shape itself for the future. When we look at our church today, we want these same elements Jesus talks about in terms of what it means to be community to be at the very fabric of what it means to be our church today. These same truths that Jesus communicates in this community discourse over 2,000 years ago are just as important in 2021 of how we live church in a healthy, vibrant, and thriving way. So I hope this has given you a little window into this discourse of Jesus as he again takes on what I would consider some very traditional rabbinical qualities to pass on to disciples that eventually are passed on to us of what it means to be community and to be church. I hope you'll join us for our final session next time. We'll look at the last discourse. It's often titled the Judgment Discourse, and it comes in the middle of Holy Week. It comes in the middle of Jesus' final week of his life on earth. And he brings forth some pretty challenging thoughts at the end. So I hope you join us for the final session next time. Thanks for being here today.